brought to you by Brand South Africa.
Welcome back to this special report on the World Economic Forum on Africa 2012. Now, with 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world being located in Africa, one of the key debates here was how to integrate Africa's economy. So a key topic that came up was the development of infrastructure and the models that are needed to try and drive that infrastructure development. Given the crucial role that infrastructure and investment play in facilitating Africa's transformation, both socially and economically, delegates across the board acknowledged that although there has been substantial progress, even more remained to be done.
Well, there have been a lot of discussions about the funding for infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion about why we need infrastructure, because we can't build infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure. And what has come out is that the African continent needs to industrialize,
right,
to allow trade between African countries. Because if one country is producing copper and another one is producing iron ore,
right,
there's no need for 2 African countries to trade. Africa needs to industrialize so that we can trade amongst ourselves, we can exchange commodities and trap capital on the African continent. Now, we in Africa have to move very fast on this issue of industrialization, and I think that it is a topic perhaps that the AU must take up in the peer review mechanisms and in the other structures of the AU. The issue of industrialization. I think, in my opinion, it becomes more important than infrastructure itself,
right,
because infrastructure is not an end on itself. You can't build a bridge where there is no water, where there is no river.
True.
So we can't be talking about building bridges. We must be talking about why we need particular infrastructure. And if we have to prioritize, we must know what our priorities are.
With a large portion of African farmers regarded as subsistence farmers, and with the continent sitting with 60% of the world's arable land, transformation of the agriculture industry on the continent remains a priority.
There was very serious disinvestment in agriculture the last 30 years. And then we had the food crisis in 2008 and 2009. And subsequently, both governments of African countries and the international development community realized that this was a red signal. And since then, there has been some efforts to try to galvanize additional resources, both from governments and from development partners. But more recently, getting the private sector to be involved. Why? Because farming, agriculture by itself is a private business. And if farmers are not linked with larger private sectors, their access to markets are constrained. And what I've seen in the last couple of years is tremendous interest by the private sector, the recognition that Africa, even though it has challenges with respect to food security, when you take those challenges and turn them around, you have tremendous opportunities. When you look at the potential of 500 million smallholders feeding the world, and the realization that they produce 80% of all the food that is consumed in the developing world, you cannot ignore them in any agricultural agenda. So what we're doing is, how can we transform subsistence agriculture to commercially viable agriculture? Commercial agriculture is not necessarily large scale. It means how can small farmers become commercial? The programs that we support in Africa and elsewhere, our major focus are how do you increase production and productivity? How do you empower women? Because women are a majority of the farmers. How do you build capacities of farmers' organizations, microfinance, rural finance, and infrastructure, small roads, feeder roads, irrigation facilities, storage facilities, and we deploy, on the average, the last 2 years, $1 billion in loans and grants to smallholder agriculture. Africa happens to be just one of 5 regions where we invest, and within Africa we have 3 regions: Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And Africa, about 50% of our resources are devoted to Africa, 23% or so to Asia, another 13% to Latin America, then North Africa and the Near East, about 11%. So Africa actually gets the majority of our resources.
Africa has huge amounts of land, and in fact Africa uses less than 10% of its arable land. And given the food security crisis that happened a few years ago globally, Africa's next biggest commodity is agriculture and land. And we're already seeing huge investors coming in to take opportunity of that. However, we need to ensure that Africans can feed themselves and regenerate their agriculture policies and investment policies to ensure that there is beneficiation processing of food into processed foods, etc., that can be used for export, but manage to retain some of that for Africans.
Yeah. Now, when you begin, of course, to talk about the issues of the stomachs, you know, the governments become very edgy because you're talking food security and you're talking national security and all those other things that may get them out of power. Are you finding a willingness among governments to engage the private sector and say, actually, perhaps private sector resources could well be the answer here?
Yes, we are. Under the World Economic Forum, an initiative called Grow Africa has emerged, and there are 7 African country governments with commitments from their heads of state to put forward investment plans to attract private sector investment to come in and commercialize a lot of the agriculture opportunities. Of course, what we're looking at in Africa, about 60 to 70% of all farming is done by smallholder farmers. Yeah. And so now the idea is, how do we convert those smallholder farmers into viable SMEs and businesses, and how do we link them into the commercial and large value chains like the retailers? Yeah. And that is the only way that we're going to effectively convert African agriculture to become commercially viable and to become an economic growth area for those countries.
Yeah. So 7 governments out of 54, that doesn't suggest there's a lot of buy-in.
Well, though these are just the 7 initial ones, there is a larger continental program called CADIP, the Comprehensive Agriculture Advancement Development Program. Yeah. And under that, there are at least about 32 countries that have signed up for this process, a compact. And what happens is that the NEPAD agency takes these governments through a process to redefine the agriculture strategy to attract investors, but also looking at policy reforms, also looking at what would be the key cash crop areas, and how do we integrate the farmers, the rural women who are predominantly the farmers in Africa, yeah, and private sector together.
In order for agricultural produce to cross borders and money to flow between markets, the importance of regional trade and integration was also highlighted as a hot topic at this year's forum. Now, we are talking about this Pan-African free trade zone. For some of us in the media, and you know the media is very skeptical always, it sounds like a pie in the sky. How real is it?
No, I think you hear about it because people recognize that it's a wonderful opportunity for African countries. That is something that needs to happen at some stage. But what I would advocate for now is a free trade area is very important. There are a number of things we need to have in place for that to happen. Once we have those things in place, then it would be a fantastic opportunity for African countries.
Minister, give me a time frame.
Time frame. Before I give you a time frame, before we achieve that, it's important that we address the sub-national, so put it this way, the regional trade. Right. So we're talking, let's look at ECOWAS. Make sure that the trade between the ECOWAS countries, the trade is going extremely well. Look at the East African countries, look at the South African countries, look at the North African countries. Once you've done that in those 4 clusters, then it becomes a lot easier, yeah, for you to have a whole Pan-African, yeah, free trade area.
From your discussions with your counterparts, is the political will there to make this happen?
I think that there's the political will, but the most important thing is that the economic importance is so critical for Africa. Because we have the resources, we have the people, we have to create jobs. When you look at trade, trade is about getting your share of the global wealth. Yeah. Trade is about getting your share of the African wealth. Trade is about creating jobs for your people. So it is so critical from an economic point of view, and I think once you look at it from there, yeah, the political will be there.
What about the structures that we have in place now that we want to facilitate this free trade area across Africa? Are those adequate? Do we need to reform some of them? We talk ECOWAS, we talk SADC, we talk EAC, we talk the Maghreb Union.
Well, we need a lot of structural reforms to start with. Okay. One of it, as I said, is strengthening those sub-regions to start with. Make sure that they trade within West African countries, for example, make sure that we remove all the barriers. There are about 4 or 5 major barriers there that we need to address. Yep. And that applies to the other regions as well. Once you deal with that, then you want to look at Africa as a common customs zone, because you have to look at the trade barriers within the different nationals,
Right.
and look at an effective way of bringing down those barriers, both trade and non-trade barriers.
Minister, that sounds complicated because I'm looking at the European experiment. It seems to be unraveling in parts, if you like. Is that the right approach? Is that a good model for us to be following, or we need to reinvent the wheel here?
No, we're reinventing our world. The European countries have been trading amongst each other for many, many years. They have moved from exporting primary products to value-added products, manufactured products. So it's a slightly different scenario you're looking at. We have to look at our own situation as Africans. We have to come up with a model that works for Africa.
Okay.
And that's what we're trying to do.
As the sun sets on Addis Ababa and we conclude this year's edition of the World Economic Forum on Africa, and we look back on some of the major themes that have dominated debate at this year's meeting, such as integrating Africa's economies and building the infrastructure that's required, including both private as well as public funds, to ensure that Africa grows and accelerates to the next stage. We look forward to hosting you at the next meeting in Cape Town, where we shall be looking back on some of the major themes and commitments that were made at this year's meeting and ensure that we raise those pertinent issues and ask the necessary questions. Have those been followed up, and what more needs to be done to ensure that Africa truly transforms? From this year's meeting, I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. Goodbye.